Welcome to the Easy Baby Podcast, where we share practical tips and information to make your pregnancy and the first months of your baby's life the best they can be. Visit easybaby.co.za for more information on our online courses.
Hello, mums and dads, and welcome back to the Easy Baby Podcast series. We're on episode 9, and today's show is all about crawling. Is crawling important? What does it mean if your baby doesn't crawl? And how do we get the most out of crawling for our babies? So I'll start by admitting front and center that when I started the research for this podcast, I thought I knew everything there was to know about crawling and the effects that crawling can have on a child. But I tell you what, as I started to research and as I started to speak to some really interesting people, I dug up some facts that might change the way that you look at how and why your baby crawls. So as we get into the show, please keep in mind that the Easy Baby podcast is for reference only and should not be used to take the place of your medical specialist's diagnosis and treatment when it comes to the health of your baby. So crawling, it generally begins anywhere from about 6 to 8 months of age, and mostly crawling is a result of babies becoming hugely curious of the world around them and a want to explore their new environment. But babies don't just miraculously jump up on all fours and start to motor about. They follow a process that starts with rolling and scooting and shifting, and then to a more classic leopard crawl, which is flat on the belly, and they need to practice and practice and practice these techniques because these are the first steps towards your baby's independence. In fact, there are many kinds of pre-crawls, from the belly crawl to the crab to leapfrog, but the most important fact at this stage is that your baby is showing you that he's ready to interact with the world around him. Being able to move around freely opens up the world to your baby, and it profoundly changes the way he experiences his environment, himself, and you. Before this, he's just a passenger. Yes, he does move around, but he's more just along for the ride than anything else. But now with crawling, his brain has to start doing some pretty serious calculations regarding body movement, his positioning, where he is, where he's going, and of course where he's been. Within a few weeks, this stomach leopard crawling turns into a position that gets baby up on all fours. Now this is followed by a period of rocking backwards and forwards, almost like they're a bit stuck in neutral. Then there's a brief stint of moving backwards on all fours, and this is fine and generally happens because babies' upper body strength tends to be more than the strength of their lower body. And then finally they balance out and they should be off in this true crisscross, opposite hand, opposite knee, classic crawling style at around 9 to 10 months of age. Now, each of these stages are important, and each of them molds your baby's nervous system in a different way. There is, however, a definite trend that our babies are starting, and they're starting to hit this crawling milestone later, if at all. And this, interestingly, it has to do with the fact that they spend so much time off their tummies nowadays. This can be traced back to a campaign that was launched by the WHO in 1994, which is called the Back to Sleep campaign. And whilst this campaign did the world of good, preventing many cases of SIDS, or sudden infant death syndrome, by having kids sleep on their back instead of spending time on their stomach, it had the unforeseen side effect of, number one, causing what we call plagiocephaly, or flattened heads, because of the amount of time and constant pressure on the skull from lying on the back. But number two, it kept babies off their tummies. But the fact that we're reaching this milestone later could also be due to the fact that Western babies spend so much time in things like car seats and in high chairs and carriers instead of on the ground, on the stomach, developing muscle tone. So as a result of this, we start to see a lot of kids who crawl funny, or they crawl for a short period before moving to walking, or they don't crawl at all. So the answer to this is supervised tummy time, and it's vital in allowing our babies opportunity to develop their crawling skill. When they're on their tummies, they learn what the world looks like from that position. They learn what it feels like to bear weight on their joints in that position. So tummy time initially is best done in short bursts. If you can do tummy time with your baby during nappy changes, I find that works really well. So what we do is prepare everything. You can take the clothes off baby, take the nappy off, put them onto the tummy just for 2 minutes. That's all you need while you get the next nappy ready and you get all your cream ready. Then babies had 2 minutes on their tummy. You can then take them and do the nappy change. And if you get that right 8, 9, 10 times a day, those 2 minutes start to add up quite nicely. Another good way of doing things is to have your baby on your chest and talk to him, because this encourages him to extend his neck and to look up at your face. But why crawling? What are the benefits of crawling? So in physical terms, crawling strengthens the trunk muscles, the shoulder muscles, the hand muscles, and the core muscles enough to be able to support their weight against gravity, and enough to be able to let them maintain balance while they're shifting their weight from one side to the other. And it gives them muscle patterning that they're going to use later on in their fine motor skill. Crawling forms the foundations of a healthy spine, as the arms and legs have to move around the spine, creating torsion on the spinal joints that prepare babies' joints for the rigors of the walking that's going to come. The spinal curves in the neck and the lower back are formed during this time of crawling. And so crawling lays the foundation for a good spinal posture. Moving straight to walking, while it might be easier on parents, it allows the control of the legs to develop independently to the control of the upper body. And this can affect synchronicity between the two. But crawling is not just physical. Repetitive exercise patterns like crawling activate nerve cells in the brain and create pathways that become bigger and more solidified the more your baby crawls. This is because his nerves are not inanimate wires that just transfer electrical signals. His nerves are alive, and as your baby moves, his brain receives feedback from the muscles and joints which feed the nervous system information about how his body is functioning. So crawling is not just a physical milestone, but it's a brain development milestone as well. And it works both ways. Crawling does develop patterns in the brain, but baby's brain needs to be in a position to control the arms and legs before crawling can start in earnest. And this again is why tummy time is so important. It's also the first time that your baby's sensory systems have to integrate with each other. So this means that crawling is the first time when vision, balance or inner ear, and proprioception, or knowing where your joints are in space, become coordinated and connected in your baby's brain. It's important for your baby to create and have mature connections between these systems so that later in life his brain can be left to deal with more complex issues. Having your vision, balance, and proprioceptive systems work together is the only way to know where you are in space and to be able to maneuver around. Now, these are two things that are really necessary for crawling. Binocular vision, or both eyes working as a team to adjust and focus on one target, is also developed during crawling. and it's a skill that's needed in the classroom to check onto the board at the front of the class and then back again to the work on the desk. And this skill is developed by looking into the distance by a crawling baby and then back again at their hands. Also, babies cross the midline with their eyes while watching each hand as it moves forward. And this develops hand-eye coordination as well as cross-communication between each side of the brain. This linking of the brain hemispheres is also developed by the fact that babies crawl with right leg and left arm moving together at the same time. So the motor nerve impulses which cause this to happen in the arms and legs start in each side of the brain and they cross the brainstem, which creates continuity between the sides. And these are the same patterns that they're going to continue to use later in life when they walk and run or move objects from hand to hand or even when they take notes in class.
Please feel free to contact the show at any time with questions you may have or topics you would like us to cover in future shows. Email us at info@easybaby.co.za.
So the more crawling babies do, the more of these connections they create to use later in life. And this process is called lateralization. And it determines which side of the brain becomes dominant in certain activities and skills. So, for example, if you throw a ball at a young child, he will reach out with both hands for it. But if you do the same thing to an older child who's gone through this process, he will catch with what's become his dominant hand, because his brain has decided which hand is more skillful for that specific task. Crawling also allows babies to develop depth perception. They are born with this skill, but initially to babies, everything which is far away seems to us like the stars in the sky. Everything is as far away as everything else. But crawling gives these babies the experience to be able to calibrate and memorize how to navigate to the couch and how far away the toy box is by how far I had to crawl to get there. So the majority of this activity happens around 8 months of age. And this is when our brains have the most amount of connections that they will ever have. After this, we start something called pruning, which is where we start cutting down on the connections in the brain. And this is when some areas become strongly linked to other areas, like the area of vision and the area of spatial skills become connected with motor planning areas. And after a while, as crawling becomes automatic, those extra unneeded connections are pruned away, and we're left with the certain pathways that we've developed. So as you can see, crawling develops body strength, brain development, and perception. These are developed by crawling much more than they are developed by walking early. It also develops tactile skills by learning surfaces and textures. As they crawl, babies create more and more connections, and each of those connections is a solution to a problem that they have solved by and with crawling. It is great for babies to reach their milestones quickly, but babies should never be pushed into a milestone. For example, putting a child into a sitting position too early might sound like a great idea because it will strengthen them for crawling and walking. But if their neck is not yet ready to support the head, you just end up with a baby that has stress on their neck, stress on their back, stress on their hips, and is using all his energy just to stabilize his head, instead of using his energy to develop the initial skills of balance and vision that he's going to need for the next step. And because of this, you might then end up missing a step or missing something completely because you have lacked the basic development by pushing them too soon. Some babies have even been shown to hold their breath in a sitting position if they're not ready because it creates stability. Now, all babies have an inner timetable, and however good our intentions might be, we can see that pushing the development generally leads to skipping goals instead of making goals. And when we let babies develop at their own speed, their motor skills then go beyond the basic balance and sitting and walking. And then they develop the ability to concentrate, to pay attention, to problem solve, and most importantly, to begin to rely on themselves. So what happens if babies don't crawl? Well, there are two schools of thought here. One says that it's not how a baby moves around, but it's more the fact that they have the drive to move. That's what's more important. So it follows that it doesn't matter if they never do the crisscross crawling or if they scoot or they bum shuffle, just as long as they show the desire to move around. Now, I agree with the desire, but the problem I have with this theory is that if a baby doesn't crawl, there's usually an underlying cause of why they're not crawling. And that underlying cause is more important than the actual lack of crawling itself. And when I say crawling here, I'm more talking about the classic crisscross pattern, which creates the crossing the midline and the lateralization. Now, it is possible that some of these babies don't have the energy to move themselves around because they're possibly low-tone babies, or they have a neural problem where the brain doesn't send enough nerve impulse to the muscle, and the muscle themselves don't receive the signals, so they become weak. A problem like this can lead to future complications. So instead of crawling being the big issue, this becomes the issue, but it's been underlying and we didn't look at it because we said, well, they crawled how they crawled. So either way, a lack of crisscross crawling at this age can be a clue that your baby is struggling with the milestone. Another reason for a lack of crawling could be a retained brainstem reflex called the symmetric tonic neck reflex. So this reflex arrives between 6 and 9 months, and it's there to help your baby get from his tummy to all fours. So what happens is when he lifts his head, the reflex causes his arms to automatically straighten and his legs to automatically bend. And this lands him in a sitting back on his heels position. And when he tilts his head down, the opposite happens, where his arms bend and his legs straighten, leaving him with his bum in the air. Now, over time, these two movements combine with him looking down and looking up, and it becomes a fluid motion that lifts him up onto all fours. The problem is that sometimes this reflex does its job, but it is retained. Your body or your baby's body doesn't get rid of this reflex. And you can imagine if that reflex sticks around, it means your baby can't crawl because every time the neck does something, the limbs automatically flex and extend, and it makes it near impossible to develop that crisscross pattern. Now, interestingly, if this reflex is retained, it means that when these kids are school-going age, you can imagine it's hard for them to sit at a desk with arms and legs bent while their heads move up and down looking from the board back to their desk and their work. Because of this, they tend to be the kids that can't sit still in class. They always look agitated and they're sometimes labeled hyperactive. Or the fact that babies are not crawling could be something as simple and as easy to fix as not enough tummy time or not having the motivation to go out and crawl. The other school of thought comes from occupational therapists. Now, their data shows that not all children who miss the crawling milestone have issues, but it does show that all the children they see with bilateral integration issues, which mean that the sensory systems aren't linked properly, didn't crawl. And this shows the importance of crawling because it is the first time that your child's big sensory systems have to act together. So take, for example, reading. The eyes must cooperate perfectly to take in the information, but we don't read with our eyes, we read with our brains. And to be able to swing our eyes across the page and still have them take in information which is processed by the brain without skipping a beat, both sides of the brain need to be in perfect sync for this to be able to happen. And if they aren't, kids will have a tough time with reading because they can't cross the midline and then carry on going. It's like they get stuck on the vertical and they have to stop reading and their brain has to start reading again. Now, this is true for both eyes, both ears, both hands, both feet, core muscles on both sides of the body. And this may be not to the point where it's a diagnosable issue, but it could hold their brains back from getting involved with more complex tasks. So occupational therapists also see a lot of compensatory strategies in children that help them cope if they didn't get the sensory foundation in place with crawling. Now, what if they don't crawl crisscrossed? So the neurodevelopmental physios say that this affects symmetry and coordination in your walking pattern later in life because it is based in at least some part on your initial crawling technique. So make sure to crawl-proof your house when the time does come for your child to start dashing around. Cover electrical outlets, put soft bumpers or protectors around hard table edges. Remember to lock all your drawers and cabinets. Got to secure the furniture like bookcases. Pull up any hanging window blind cords and scan the floor for buttons and coins. Now, my theory on crawling lies somewhere between the two mainstream ideas. Anthropologists now think that crawling is a relatively new human activity. And they base this on the fact that there are still hunter-gatherer tribes like the ones in Papua New Guinea where babies don't crawl at all. They're held until they walk and maybe are propped up into sitting just before they walk. And these people don't seem to suffer any ill effect from this, nor do children in similar tribes in Paraguay and Mali in Indonesia. So crawling is seen as a recent development, only having had been around for the past century or two. And this is round about the time we started making raised flooring, which is more hygienic to leave babies on. A study in Bangladesh showed more babies there are carried till walking because it limits their exposure to dirty floors and germs that can cause diarrhea. Another thought is that babies in developing human societies would be held up because of the danger of predators and hot coals from ground cookfires until they were able to walk themselves. Now, what got me thinking was a study of these same Papua New Guinea children a few years later, and it showed that they could not hop on one leg. And this is a feat that's not really needed in their day-to-day lives, but it does require one leg to work and the opposite arm to work in tandem to balance them out. And this, of course, requires lateralization of the brain. And they don't get this because they don't crawl. So could crawling be an evolutionary stage that we as humans have added to our development? Because in our ever-advancing society, where fine motor coordination and sensory integration are seen as a standard requirement, which it isn't in more basic societies, a standard requirement for our brains to be able to move on to more complex problems. Look at what was expected of us as parents when we were in grade 1, and look at what is expected from our children now. The advancement is so fast-paced that our babies now need every opportunity to be able to coordinate and integrate their sensory and motor systems to thrive in our fast-paced world. Lastly, when do we get worried if our babies are not crawling? So kids should be moving or at least attempting to move by 9 months. If there's no attempt by your baby and baby seems to possibly only use one side of his body to move around, those are warning signs that it's time to get help. Kids that have suffered many ear infections tend to have issues that push back their rolling and crawling because their balance is thrown off, and then once the infections are treated, they can feel a bit insecure about moving because they are now processing all of this proprioception and vision and balance for the first time together. So that is our podcast on crawling. Thank you very much for tuning in, and a special thank you to Tracy Fenter, occupational therapist from the Children's Therapy Center, for filling in my blanks and for helping us all understand crawling and to better understand our babies. Thank you very much for tuning in. Remember that you can catch us on tunein.com, you can catch us on iTunes, you can catch us on Stitcher Radio. If you found that you got some benefit from this episode, please make sure that you share and share alike with your friends and family and new parents that you feel could benefit. Otherwise, from myself, Dr. Mike Marinas, take care and enjoy your baby.
If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe. And remember to check out our pre- and postnatal education courses at easybaby.co.za. You got this.